She looked me right in the eye and said, "You're a nobody." The words were small, childish, but they landed like a stone in a glass of fine china. Every set of forks on the table froze. My son smirked. My daughter-in-law smiled in that way that pretends something is amusing when it isn't. Around us, the table laughed, polite at first, then openly, and the sound felt like a chorus of tiny knives. I had on my navy dress that night, the one Dave liked because it matched the pearls Frank had given me for our 30th anniversary. We were at Jessica's birthday dinner, fancy place with linen napkins and a wine list that made me feel slightly scandalous when I ordered. Chloe was perched on the banquette, dressed like a miniature hostess, and someone had fed her a line beforehand. I can still see how she said it, precise, as if she'd been coached on enunciation. "You're a nobody, Grandma." There are many small humiliations. This one was public and sharp. It wasn't the money, although money had been the soft, steady erosion beneath everything. It was the awareness that those I trusted had decided I was dispensable enough to make a joke of. The pearls flashed under the restaurant lights as if they too were mocking me. I did what my mother taught me to do when insulted at the table. I laid my napkin down, folded it neatly, and left. I didn't make a scene. I didn't shout. I walked out into the night and let the doors shut on their laughter. At home, under the dim kitchen light where that house remembers my husband more than I do, my phone buzzed. A message from a number I had long ago saved as Dave Mortgage. For 3 years I had been paying that mortgage. Not begrudgingly, no, not that. I had been proud to help. I had been proud to keep a roof over my son's head when work was thin, to help his kids have a stable place to sleep. I had paid the mortgage every month, while his name stayed on the deed and his responsibilities stayed, apparently, in the form of excuses. The message was a reminder in the driest of tones. "Payment still due tomorrow?" I read it, then read it again. I thought of Chloe's tiny face, of the way she enunciated "nobody," as if it were a fact she had been asked to confirm. I thought of 3 years of receipts tucked into the file under my kitchen drawer, mortgage payments, a school tuition here, a bill for break work there, a check for a family vacation they promised they'd pay me back for and never did. I thought of Frank's garden, his roses that I tended because he no longer could, and how for years I had tended other people's gardens too, until mine felt dangerously unwatered. I typed 3 words and then erased 2. I made it 1. Figure it out. I hit send and sat back in the chair where I used to grate papers, where the ink from 1,000 red pens had once stained the bottoms of my fingers. For the first time in a long time, sleep came. If you're watching and this story hits a chord, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments, and if you like real-life stories, go ahead and hit subscribe. But stay with me. This is only the start. I am Margaret Sullivan, Maggie to neighbors, Miss Sullivan to generations of students who still drop by with updates about grandchildren and recipes that never quite pass muster. I'm 67, retired after 38 years in a classroom, where I learned mostly that children are honest and adults are not always brave. Widowed at 60, I learned another kind of independence. Frank's last winter took him in pieces, and by the time he was gone, I found myself rearranging my life around the quiet. The backyard that reminded me of him, the kettle that always seemed to whistle at the wrong time, and a bank account I was suddenly terrified would be more complicated than it had to be. David, my eldest, had always been like water, finding a path through problems without stopping to notice what he left behind. He is charming in the way small storms are charming, quick, warm, and wrecking whatever is in their path. Jessica, his wife, is smarter than the room gives her credit for, and, as it turns out, capable of an astonishingly comfortable cruelty when it must be shared. I had wanted to help. I suppose that is the story of a lot of parents, how love and habit can become a river that sweeps you along because it feels wrong to step out of it. For 3 years, I paid the mortgage on David's house, not as a loan with papers and signatures, not as an investment, just quietly from my account to his. I made payments for tuition 1 year for Tyler's summer program, covered a broken transmission, bought plane tickets for a funeral they couldn't afford. When I sat down and counted, because of course I counted, I found that the mortgage payments were about $48,000 in total. Add to that the other things, tuition, car repairs, the odd promise for paid by silence, and the number approached $60,000. $60,000 is a lot for a retired teacher who had planned to live modestly into her 80s, pruning roses and reading cookbooks. I am not proud of the money. I am not ashamed. I simply became aware, really aware, on that night. The word nobody pried loose a truth I had been refusing to face, By making myself their bank, I had made myself invisible. They could take and take because I would always be there to say yes. When someone treats your kindness as a resource, not a gift, something has to change. The next morning, the phone began to ring. Not 1 or 2 calls, an avalanche. "Mom," began David's voice on the third call, the one where his charm had finally frayed into something like anger. "You can't do this. We have to." He tried 100 scripts: worry, obligation, need, the classic family line. He called me selfish, which is a neat tactic when someone wants to make you feel guilty for asserting yourself. Jessica texted fury and faux confusion. My sister, who lives 2 towns over and is normally a person who irons napkins for pleasure, called to tell me that maybe we should talk this through. There was a pattern: pressure first, then a drip of shame, then the kind of entitlement that imagines a parent's savings as an inexhaustible well. David came by that afternoon. He brought a casserole, store-bought, because of course he did, and sat in my living room where Frank's portrait watches the television. He said, "You're making a mistake, Mom." He put on the voice I'd heard since he was small, the voice that could turn a scolding into a conversation, the voice that could make you feel the size of your mistakes as if they were your only worth. "I didn't marry you so I could be your ATM," he said finally, softer than the words deserved. "Think about Chloe. Think about the kids." I thought about them. I thought about Tyler's crooked teeth, the way Chloe hummed when she concentrated on a coloring page. I lined them up like evidence and felt, despite my training as a teacher and a mother, a beginner at the game. My friend Ruth said I was being theatrical. "You're a widow. How many drama-free years have you promised yourself?" she asked. She has a point, but when kindness is used as a cover for entitlement, denying the truth becomes a deeper theater. Something had to be named. When I mentioned a private investigator, some eyebrows lifted. It sounds dramatic, but when you feel the carpet being pulled from under you, you do things you didn't expect. I hired a PI discreetly. I told myself I was simply making sure my accounts were okay. He was quieter than I expected, a man who smelled faintly of coffee and carried a camera the size of a small cat. He watched bank transfers, monitored accounts that had strange small withdrawals, and watched who came to the house in the middle of the night. What he sent back to me at the end of the month were reports with clean, factual summaries and a few blurred photos he apologized for. "I can't get the whole truth in a shot," he told me, which is to say he could show the pattern. I am fond of facts. Facts are less slippery than emotions and often kinder to the spirit. The facts were small and mundane. Transactions shifted through accounts that did not logically belong there. A check that should have gone to the utility company had been rerouted to a business I'd never heard of. An identity alert on one of my credit cards that an unfamiliar device had tried to access. None of these alone would make for a headline. Together, they looked like a trail someone left when walking away with their hands full of things that weren't theirs. Closing the bank of Maggie, I told my friend Ruth with a short laugh the night I sent that message and made no more payments. It made me laugh because once you call something by its proper name, it loses some of its power. Saying it out loud was like tightening a fist around a loose tooth and deciding you'd had enough of being in pain. That name, the Bank of Maggie, became a tiny joke I carried like a shield. I did not know then that it would also become a line my family used with resentment in their voices, as if I had committed an act of theft by reclaiming my autonomy. In our family, calling things by their proper name felt like a betrayal, but language has a way of freeing you when the truth is ugly. The pressure escalated. Once words failed, tactics changed. The calls became legal-sounding. The polite texts turned into hints about my wellness and my capacity. There is a phrase deployed in families like a battering ram: "We need to protect you." It sounds caring. It smells, in practice, of control. I had divorced guardianship conversations in the abstract for years, the sort of dry, non-existent drama people talk about over coffee. But this was not abstract. A week after I stopped writing checks, a packet arrived in the mail. The envelope was thick. Judging by the way their name was printed on the return address, it was from David's attorney. I opened the packet with a teacher's hands, careful, methodical. Inside were documents I had only ever seen on television, the sort of formal language that makes your stomach feel small. A petition for conservatorship. That is an ugly word if you've never needed one. It is uglier still coming from your child. It said they were concerned about my ability to manage my finances, referenced recent lapses and worrisome decisions, and requested the court's intervention to appoint someone to make decisions on my behalf. There are moments when a life you have led suddenly looks like a story someone else is telling. I read the petition twice, then read it again to see if the words had rearranged themselves into something kinder. They had not. The suggestion that I was incapable, thinly veiled in legalese and wrapped in the cloak of care, made my blood feel like cold ink. They were asking a judge to make me invisible, to hand over my autonomy to the very people who had been treating my savings as a family fund. I called Sarah Blackwood that afternoon. Sarah is a conservatorship and elder law attorney with the kind of calm voice people trust in the heat of crises. She has a reputation among the small, nervous circles of people who worry about families. She does not sugarcoat, she does not preach, and she will call the problem by its name. When someone files for conservatorship, the court wants to see evidence, she said, not unkindly. They want proof that a person is incapable of managing their own affairs. She listed the items, not to instruct the viewer, but to let you know how the system reads a dispute. Medical evaluations, financial statements, sworn declarations, those are the things judges look to. We will gather what we need, Miss Sullivan. We will object firmly. I told her about the PI. I told her about the bank statements. I told her about the nobody that had been said at a restaurant and the laughter that had followed. She asked for copies and for permission to speak to my physician. We will prepare, she said. There was a tenderness in the way she said it that had nothing to do with sentimentality and everything to do with purpose. I wanted somehow to be the kind of person who could handle this with dignity, not because dignity is a shield against pain, but because it makes the fight cleaner. In the days that followed, the house felt like a room with two televisions playing opposing channels, one with the normal sounds, tea kettle, the hum of the refrigerator, the scratch of my pen, and the other with a low, insistent thrum of messages arriving and plans being hatched. David's call shifted tone again. There were threats now, thinner and angrier, about what would happen if I did not cooperate. The word cooperate has a soft, polite surface. In practice, it means yield. I started to record things. I do not like to think of myself as the kind for hidden microphones or dramatics, but there is a strange bravery that comes when you feel cornered. I taped a couple of conversations where David used my generosity as an accusation, and where Jessica practiced a kind of strategic helplessness. I am not proud of the peaking. I am proud of the clarity it brought. The recordings were not melodramatic. They were thin and cracked. They captured, though, the tone of entitlement and the strategies of coercion. Detective Rodriguez came by at one point, not in a suit, but in plain clothes, with a badge that did everything it was supposed to do. It made me feel less invisible. He listened, took notes, and didn't try to be dramatic. We see this pattern a fair amount, he said. Adults using their parents' finances as a resource, then claiming caretaking when it suits them. He asked me for the folder, the canceled checks, the names of businesses that had received payments. I felt ridiculous and relieved handing them over. It is an odd thing to feel vindicated by a bureaucracy, to be soothed by forms and signatures. There were other visits. My neighbor Linda brought over lemon bars and asked if I needed anything. My sister called twice a day and offered to stay with me, just in case. Frank's chair in the living room remained empty, and sometimes in the evenings I would sit there and imagine him laughing at our troubles, his voice a low, warm noise from the past. You're not the same as those children, Margaret, I told myself aloud. You built something with your life that is yours. And yet the conservatorship petition hung over the house like a storm cloud. On the evening the court date was set, I lay awake thinking of the small indignities that had built up over the years, the loan that was never repaid, the vacations I had paid for to keep my son smiling, the kind of generosity that becomes an expectation. I pictured Chloe again at the restaurant, as precise as a schoolgirl acting out a line, and felt the anger ignite. It was not a vengeful anger. It was a clarity that tasted metallic and bright. There are decisions that are slow-motion revelations. There are others that happen in a single night, in a single word. Figure it out was not cruel, at least not in the way people mean when they say cruel. It was an assertion of the small, stubborn fact that my life was mine to manage. That night, after the conservatorship papers arrived, and after David's voice had thinned into threats, I went into the garden and pruned Frank's roses. The motion steadied me. The smell of cut stems grounded me. I thought of the children I had raised with lesson plans and glue and patience. I thought about the person I had been to them. I thought about the person I wanted to be now. The next morning, David's attorney delivered something in person, a formal proposal to have me evaluated for competence. They insisted it was in my best interest, and for the children. It is amazing how quickly people discover the language of concern when they wish to seize control. I signed nothing. The idea that the system would choose for me felt like a betrayal of the life I had earned. By then, I had already started gathering other witnesses, former students who knew my clarity, neighbors who had watched the pattern of visits and pickups, and Ruth, who was unwilling to let me become a caricature of a confused older woman. I also contacted Marcus Webb, who had helped a friend of mine with a small restitution issue years ago. His name was in my Rolodex because small towns keep small favors like currency. Marcus understood money and law and the ways they intertwine. He didn't promise miracles, he promised to look. There are moments when the machinery of family protection turns toward you with good intentions and rotten motives. I am not blind to the fact that some conservatorships are necessary. They can protect those who cannot protect themselves. But when the very people who would claim to guard your interests are the same ones who have the steadiest hands in your pocket, suspicion is not arrogance, it is prudence. After the petition came, my world narrowed for a time to phone calls and paperwork. The PI's reports came in a neat stack. They were clinical, sparse. There were bank transfers to accounts with unfamiliar names. There were small transfers timed around birthdays and holidays, just enough to look plausible. There was one record, though, that made my breath catch, a string of withdrawals from my account to businesses I had never heard of, some with names that could have been anything. A few were software companies, a couple were repair services, one was a prepaid card service. I could not tell from the paperwork alone if this was incompetence, fraud, or something softer, an arrangement that had calcified into pattern. But the more I saw, the less comfortable I felt with the idea that this was a mistake. Mistakes do not usually arrive like a long, slow drip. Mistakes do not teach children to call their grandmother nobody. One afternoon, while filing through statements, Tyler came by. He is older than Chloe by a handful of years, 12 then. He stood in my doorway like a man who hasn't decided whether he's allowed to take the step into adulthood. He looked at the folders on my table and at the papers curling at the edges. "You okay, Grandma?" he asked, the way children ask because they are offered a truth in pieces. I told him I was fine. He shrugged, as teenagers do, and said, "You always were the boss of the classroom." He meant it kindly, which is to say he meant it honestly. He had a look in his eyes that made me feel like I had just taken a test I haven't studied for, a look that tells you someone has watched things they were not meant to see.
Later that week, after David's attorney had filed the papers and after I had doubled the lock on my mailbox out of a foolish, old-fashioned sense of propriety, I got an email from Sarah with a list of what she wanted: medical records, financial statements, character witnesses, and a plan for a contested hearing. She suggested we subpoena the PI's report and possibly include my physician's notes to show competence. "The court isn't interested in feelings," she said. "They're interested in facts. We give them facts." I remember thinking, in the odd clarity of someone who has been both a teacher and a student of life, that the work of collecting facts felt like grading a test I had already written the answers to. I had lived conscientiously, but life is messy. Documents do not always show the heart. So I started to do the work of proving what I had always been: capable, clear-headed, and above all, the best judge of my own life. In the evenings, when the calls died down and the house returned to its ordinary noises, I would sit at Frank's old garden table and make lists. One section was for evidence, another for witnesses, another for the things I would never again let pass. I began to practice phrases I might need in court, concise, measured statements that sounded like Miss Sullivan, the teacher, rather than Maggie, the grandmother who had been called a nobody. I found in those lists a strange kind of peace. Standing up for yourself is rarely a spectacle. It is a quiet, deliberate narrowing of your boundaries to the parts of life that are yours. When someone tries to make you small, you make a different choice. You become precise. And then, as if the story needed an accelerant, there was a knock at the door in the early morning when the air was still soft and the roses held the night's dew. It was a clerk from the courthouse with papers. Not merely a hearing notice. No, the clerk's eyes were apologetic as she delivered an additional document, a preliminary conservatorship petition, formal, stamped, and with an attached request for a temporary appointment hearing. They asked for someone to be named temporary conservator while the court evaluated the case. I folded the papers and sat at the table. The house hummed around me, ordinary and cruel, and winter soft. There is a peculiar loneliness to having your autonomy questioned in a formal way. It demands not only proof, but courage. I felt both. I called Sarah. "They filed for a temporary appointment," I said. "They're asking for a conservator to be put in place immediately." Her voice was steady. "We will oppose it. Temporary appointments are easier to get, because judges sometimes err on the side of protection. But protection for whom? We'll need to make the case that you are capable, and that this request is rooted in taking advantage, not concern. Are they doing this to hide what they've been doing? I asked, the question punctured by nights of counting checks.
She didn't answer in the way I wanted. Rather, she said, "We'll gather evidence, and we'll be ready to argue." From that point on, the house filled with a different kind of activity. Phone calls with Sarah, a diet of forms and small signatures, and the kind of fierce, exacting calm one cultivates in order to make the law listen. The PI expanded his scope. Detective Rodriguez, whom I had told about the odd withdrawals, asked if he could take a look at certain accounts to see if there was criminal intent. I felt, in a strange way, like a gardener clearing brambles. You cut back the vines before you can see if the root is rotten. A week later, David came to the house and did not knock. He walked in and sat at the kitchen table without asking. His voice was low, and there was a tremor in it I had not heard before, the kind of thing that suggested a man caught between rage and fear. "You'll ruin us," he said. "If this goes through, we'll have nowhere to turn." He leaned across the table and used that old, practiced gaze. "Think about your grandchildren." I thought about my grandchildren. I thought about how, in the quiet of the kitchen, they had been used as leverage, tokens of guilt to be waived when I considered my own well-being. It didn't feel like protection. It felt like a transaction. "You used me," I said. I tried to keep my voice even, like a teacher correcting gentle misbehavior. "You turned my generosity into expectation." He flinched as if struck, then stormed out. The door slammed, the sound like a punctuation mark. I sat back, and for a long moment, breathed. I will not pretend it was easy. Walking the line between firmness and compassion is a skill learned by failing many times. There were nights I lay awake thinking of Frank's hands and the way he used to smooth my hair when I worried. There were afternoons I walked past my students' photos tacked to the wall and felt absurdly supported by faces from decades ago. I am not a woman of broad wealth. I am a woman of deliberate choices. The choice I made was to stop being their bank. And then, right when I thought the next step would be a court date and the ordinary grind of hearings, something else happened that no one expected. I received a call from school, the kind of call that makes your heart hop as if it were a child. It wasn't about my grandchildren. It was about a letter someone had found. The details of what followed are for another time. But what matters here is the pressure that had started to mount on all sides, family, legal, and personal, and the way it began to press the soft parts of life into lines too sharp to ignore. That pressure is a remarkable teacher. It teaches what you are willing to lose and what you will protect at any cost. It reveals loyalties and the absence of them.
Most of all, it illuminates the surprising fact that boundaries are one of the kindest things you can offer yourself, and sometimes the kindest thing you can offer your family, even when they do not understand it. A conservatorship petition is a formal question. Are you the person to manage your own life, or should someone else decide for you? It reduces your lived experience to a legal query. I resolved to answer with facts, proofs, and witnesses. I resolved to show up the way a teacher steps into her own classroom, prepared, steady, and unwilling to be bullied out of the truth. The next morning, there was another message from David. It read simply, "We have to talk." I read it and typed back, "We will, at court." Then I called Sarah and we began to map out what we would do when the petition was heard. We spoke of medical notes, of competent witnesses, of Tyler's willingness to speak about what he had seen. We did not speak of vengeance. We spoke of facts. When you stand in the middle of a life that has been both generous and taken for granted, decisions grow heavy, then decisive. I had walked out of a restaurant with my head held as straight as I could. I had written one word and slept. Now I was at the start of a fight that none of us had signed up for willingly. The stakes were not only my autonomy, they were the dignity of a woman who has taught children to believe in themselves, and who now had to remind herself of that very lesson. The conservatorship hearing loomed like a doorway I could not avoid. I prepared myself like I once prepared for midterms, organizing, practicing, rehearsing the steady cadence of a voice that had to be heard. The small household rituals continued. I watered the roses each morning, put on the navy dress, sometimes out of old habit, and set the pearls on my dresser so they could remind me of a life full of small, precious things that were mine. The legal world is cold and formal, but this fight was not merely legal. It was moral. It was about the way kindness can be mistaken for weakness, and the way a simple no can change the course of many lives. Outside, the sun kept moving across the sky, indifferent and patient. Inside, a fight was being prepared with the quiet ferocity of someone who has been pushed too far and realizes it is time to lean in. When the court papers arrived with their stamped hearing dates, I sat down at the garden table and wrote a list. People to call, documents to collect, questions to ask. It is an odd comfort to plan. The planning is a language of power. The next few days would be a tangle of lawyers, detectives, and small probing interviews. I would need witnesses who could speak to the facts of my day-to-day competence. Neighbors, friends, former students. I would need to bring clarity to a system that can be manipulated with a practiced hand. That afternoon, Tyler came by the house after school. He sat at the table and watched me file and organize like a little clerk.
He put his elbows on the table and asked, "Are you scared, Grandma?" I told him the truth. Sometimes, but mostly, I'm determined. He nodded, the way children do when they think something over. He reached for one of the folders, my handwriting on the tab, payments, and ran his fingers along the edge. "You always told us to save our work," he said. "Keep your receipts." "Yes," I said, smiling despite myself. "I did." He left with a promise to help, as teenagers do, both generous and unreliable. But he stayed the whole evening, and when he left, he gave me a small, deliberate hug. It was the kind of hug that felt like an answer to a question I hadn't asked. You cannot prepare for everything. You cannot anticipate every turn of the road. What you can do is ground yourself in the simple acts of proof and love. You can collect facts, call on people who will speak truth, and make a different kind of generosity, one that protects what matters. We were on the brink. The family had chosen a path that included legal measures designed to strip away my agency. I had chosen, in a single night and in 100 small ways after, to say no. That single word, figure it out, had been a small radical act. My children had laughed. My granddaughter had been instructed to call me nobody. But laughter, as I learned, is a fragile thing when weighed against evidence and resolve. The next step would be the hearing. It would thrum with that peculiar mixture of boredom and consequence that only a courtroom can produce. People with clipped ties would read papers. A judge would ask a question or two. My lawyer would speak calmly and with the kind of knowledge that turns paper into protection. And somewhere in the middle of all this, small lives would be affected, the children clutched in the middle of a storm their parents had made. I had loved them into existence. I had given what I could. Now I would have to fight to keep them safe from the very hands that had raised them. I don't know yet how every piece will fall. What I know is this: a night in a restaurant and a single text can change the course of a life. A word can become a hinge. You can choose at 70 or at 30 to close a door or to leave it open. I chose to close one door decades ago, the door that said I would be anyone's bank. Now I was at the point where I would have to prove that the person behind the pearls and the navy dress was very much herself. The day before the hearing, I sat in the garden and watched Tyler and Chloe play on the lawn. They were a patchwork of small joys, chasing each other around the oak, loud, messy, free in a way adults can envy. I thought of Frank's hands, the smell of wet soil, the lesson that gardens take work, and the truth that some things, like dignity and protection, are worth the effort.
I felt a strange mixture of sorrow and resolve. Sorrow for the wasted trust that had built this mess, and resolve that this time, I would be the one to write the last lines. When I stood and went inside to prepare the documents, I placed the pearls around my neck, feeling the old weight at my throat. I left the navy dress on the chair. I practiced my calm voice in the mirror, measured, clear, slightly wry, and I thought of a small, quiet thing my students used to tell each other when they'd been brave. You can do hard things. The hearing would be hard, but the hardest thing sometimes is beginning. That night, I laid everything out on the kitchen table. The folders, the PI report, the recorded conversations.
the bank statements with the 48,000 circled in my mind and the total nearing 60,000. The town outside hummed with its ordinary life. Inside, the next day would be more than a day. It would be a test of what a life of service meant when service had been turned into expectation. I don't know the ending yet. I only know the moment before the door opens, a breath taken, a hand on the knob, and the knowledge that you are about to speak for yourself. I wrapped the pearls in a small cloth and set them beside the folder labeled witnesses. Then I sat down and wrote a short note to myself, the kind of instruction a teacher leaves on a student's desk. Remember who you are. Speak truths. Keep your hands steady. I slept like a person who has finally closed a long, leaking tap, tense but less afraid. The next morning, I put on the navy dress, clipped the pearls on, and drove to the courthouse with a folder that contained my life. I walked into the courthouse like a teacher walking into a quiet classroom, heels soft, folder heavy in my hands, voice practiced and ready for the questions that would be asked. The hallway smelled faintly of disinfectant and paper. People moved with a polite, businesslike speed. I handed my documents to the clerk, clicked my pen closed twice, and followed Sarah into the small room where we would wait for the judge. The pearls felt steady at my throat, and for some reason I liked that weight. It reminded me of a lifetime of choices carried visibly. Court is a peculiar theater. It insists on formality even when the subject is human grief. The conservatories you're hearing moved with a kind of sleepy, consequential rhythm, lawyers exchanging papers, clerks calling names, a bailiff tapping a small gavel when it was time. The room filled gradually. Neighbors I'd asked to come sat near the back, faces like familiar chapters. Tyler sat in the third row, shoulders a little too broad for his age, his jaw set as if he were trying to decide which expression would be most useful to the day. Chloe held my sister's hand. She looked smaller than I expected in that place of hard chairs and echoed voices.
Judge Patricia Wells, calm, deliberate, surveyed us like a person deciding which of several stories deserved a hearing. Sarah was concise. She handed the judge a folder and spoke with the kind of restrained clarity that makes a list sound like armor. "Your Honor," she said, "we will show that Miss Sullivan is capable, that she has managed her affairs, and that the petition is rooted in an attempt to seize control of her assets under the guise of concern." David's attorney spoke later, the words smooth as a shawl. He framed the petition in the language of protection. It was all procedure and concern, phrases meant to slide like oil over a rough day. Then it was time for evidence. The air in the room thinned for a moment. People leaned forward without realizing. Sarah passed a small device to the clerk. "We have a recording we'd like to play," she said. My stomach tightened into a small stone. I had listened to those recordings in my kitchen, voice shaking at the edges like a violin string. Having them in the open felt both terrifying and absolving. The recording was short, thin, domestic. David's voice, familiar and practiced, talking about making sure Grandma understands, and in a cadence that came back to me with the clarity of a chalk line on a board, the way Chloe had been taught to say what she did at Jessica's birthday. The sound of small manipulation is muted on a recording, but in that quiet courtroom, the intent was sharp. The table went quiet in the way that silence does when a bell rings. Then came the PI's report. Transactional patterns, small transfers rerouted, accounts with unfamiliar names. Detective Rodriguez testified to the ordinary ways adult children sometimes use parents' accounts, and the red flags the ledger had shown. He spoke in plain language, the kind of straightforward vocabulary that makes complexity suddenly usable. "We saw repeated transfers," he said, patterns that suggested funds were being used outside the norms of legitimate family support. When Tyler was called, my heart folded like a page. He stood in front of the room with a slouch that still carried a child's attempt at composure. He was asked simple questions, what he had seen, what he had heard. He told the court plainly that at home he had heard instructions and had seen envelopes and transfers that did not add up. He did not embellish. Teenagers rarely do when their lives are at stake. He spoke of the night at the restaurant in a way that made it clear this was not a spiteful performance. It was a child's copy of adult cruelty. When he used Chloe's name, he did so gently, as if protection required it. That moment was the hinge. People sometimes imagine that courts are places where declarations alone tip balances. They are not. They are places where patterns are made legible. The recordings, the PI report, Tyler's testimony, they fit together like evidence is supposed to. They made the why intelligible. Judge Wells leaned back, hands steepled.
She listened to the opposing counsel's careful construction of concern
and then to Sarah's steady rebuttal. At one point, she looked directly at me and asked a question I had practiced answering, but still needed to feel. "Miss Sullivan," she said, "are you capable of managing your day-to-day affairs?" "I am," I said. My voice sounded like a bell in a small room. It surprised me with its steadiness. I've managed my own affairs for decades. I keep records, I pay my bills, I make rational decisions. I saw a pattern I could no longer accept, and I asked for help. She asked about the recordings. Sarah explained their context. Detective Rodriguez explained how those patterns look to law enforcement. The judge nodded at the PI's documentation, at the bank statements with neat, ugly lines of transfers, and at Tyler's clear-eyed testimony. She folded her hands and made a decision with a calmness that felt almost merciful. "Based on the testimony and the documentation presented," she said, voice formal but not unkind, "the court finds insufficient cause to appoint a conservator at this time. The petition for conservatorship is denied. However, given the nature of the allegations, I will refer the matter to the appropriate agency for investigation of potential financial exploitation." The phrase financial exploitation landed in the room like a finality. It did not feel like triumph so much as recognition. The judge's referral meant someone would look deeper with authority. It meant our small, private pain had been translated into something that could be addressed in public, with procedure and consequences. I left the courtroom steadier than I'd felt in months. It was not the end. It was the beginning of a process that would reveal more than a family argument. It would require institutions to reckon with actions taken under a family roof. What I did not expect, and what I suppose I should have, was how some people respond when a plan they've relied upon starts to unravel. The next morning, there was an empty driveway at David's house, an open back gate, and a U-Haul that hadn't been there before. There were missing cars, and at first, an odd silence on the phone. For a few days, the calls were full of denials, excuses, promises to come back. Then there were the small destabilizing things, late payments to accounts we had tracked, addresses that could not be found. It felt like the kind of hurried retreat one makes when a structure you've depended on becomes hazardous. CPS arrived quietly at my door a week later. Maria Santos, the caseworker, was direct and humane in the way people who have held too much of other people's lives must be. She told me that the children had been brought to the attention of her office because their parents had left amid chaos, and there were concerns for the children's welfare. The words emergency placement are terrible in their efficiency.
She explained options: temporary foster care, kinship placement, or a family friend stepping in. My immediate reaction, I confess, was a stubborn refusal to be swept into a paternalistic narrative. "I'm their grandmother," I said. "They have a home." Maria listened. She is a professional. She is also, perhaps, a person who has seen too many complicated truths. "We have to assess what's best for the children right now," she said. She explained that someone would need to do a careful assessment of stability, safety, and capacity. "If you want custody," she added quietly, "you will need to make a formal request." I had not expected the sting of that sentence, "if you want custody." It was a doorway that flattened everything into a procedural shape. For a moment I resented the implication that maternal love alone was qualification enough. It is not. It must be matched with competence, stability, and a lifestyle the state deems suitable. But beneath the annoyance, there was a simpler truth. I loved them, and loving them was no longer enough to keep them safe. The emergency placement was with Linda and Tom Morrison, a couple from 2 streets over who had fostered children before. They were kind with the practiced kindness of people who know how to keep frightened things fed and in their beds. I went to visit on a weekday. The house smelled of cinnamon and someone's art project. Chloe sat at a table with crayons, colors spread like a small map. Tyler, who had been living with me some nights, helped do homework at their kitchen island. The children looked not like casualties, but like children who had stepped into new routines. At first, I told Maria and myself that I'd just be a stopgap. I would not take on the legal responsibility. Too frail, too complicated, too much for someone who had plans for quiet afternoons of pruning roses. But on that first visit, the way Chloe's face relaxed when she saw me, how she leaned into my shoulder with a trust that was old and not yet broken, I felt something else shift. I had taught children for 38 years. I recognized what a child needs to feel safe. The Morrisons were capable and kind, but they were not the children's grandmother.
they could not replace what I had been doing, what I was still willing to do, if the system permitted it. 2 months after the conservatorship hearing, when the investigators had followed the trail that the PI and Detective Rodriguez had started, when subpoenas had been issued and evidence was being collected under the clear light of official inquiry, the FBI, yes, the federal authorities, made arrests. It was a sequence I could not have imagined. Agents in suits, a safe deposit box opened by subpoena, and charges that suggested a wider criminal enterprise involving fraud and identity theft. Detective Jennifer Walsh, who had stepped in as a cooperating investigator, was firm and methodical.
She explained the legal lines with the bluntness of someone used to translating complexity into court. David and Jessica were arrested on federal charges relating to fraud and identity theft, and later indicted. The scope of the investigation revealed transfers and businesses that had been used to launder funds in ways I had only glimpsed in the PI's sparse notes. There was no drama in the arrest beyond the ordinary solemnity of handcuffs and statements read. I went to court to be a witness to that process, as if by being present I could tether the moment to the life I had tried to protect. I testified in a different setting for the federal case. That experience is another kind of publicness, cold, clarifying, and vast. The federal courtroom felt different from the small conservatorship hearing. The questions were precise, the transcripts exacting. I gave them dates, I explained transfers, I handed over what the PI had sent me. Detective Walsh laid out the investigation in ways that made the breadth of what David and others had done appear in statistics and timelines. Marcus Webb, who represented victims on certain restitution claims, joined to make sure the human dimension of the financial harm was not lost amidst financial matrices. There is a terrible privacy to having your money misused. You feel violated in a way that mixes shame with fury. Standing there, answering questions about checks and transfers and the function of certain businesses whose names I had never really understood, I felt like a school teacher marking the wrong answers, methodically, with a clear pen. It was not satisfying in the way revenge is imagined. It was satisfying in the way seeing a problem documented is satisfying. The pattern, once visible, is harder to deny. In the months that followed, criminal proceedings unfolded with a slow inevitability. David was convicted on the federal charges. Jessica's involvement was clarified in testimony and financial records. She was also part of the legal scrutiny. I cannot and will not turn this into a spectacle of schadenfreude. Conviction is not entertainment. It is the outcome of law addressing harm. For me, sitting in a courtroom to hear a guilty verdict was less a celebration than a confirmation that the system had finally caught up to a set of behaviors that had devastated more than bank accounts. Meanwhile, CPS and the family court were sorting out the children's placement. After careful assessments and hearings where social workers testified to my fitness and to the children's needs, Judge Wells, or a judge in family court, awarded me custody. It was a practical thing. The children needed continuity, someone with legal standing and a history of involvement in their lives. I remember the finality of the judge's announcement and the way it set a new table in our lives. There were conditions, of course, home visits, ongoing reports, school placements, but the heart of it was simple. The children would live with me.
Taking them home felt like both a relief and an enormous responsibility. I had always been generous, but generosity and guardianship are different skills. Guardianship requires routine and resource planning. It requires dealing with schools and immunization records, with doctors and dentist appointments, with the small but crucial things that make childhood stable. Tyler, who had been suspended between houses for a while, started sleeping in the room that had been his since elementary school. Chloe took the corner by the oak tree that Frank had planted the year our daughter was born and declared it Grandma's reading spot. We rearranged the house in a series of small, practical stages: a better desk for homework, shelves for textbooks, hooks for backpacks. I found that parenting in your later years is equal parts patience and logistics. There was laughter, there is always laughter in families, and there were school nights where I fell asleep halfway through a reading assignment, my glasses crooked on my nose. There were also nights when I made arrangements to meet with a financial planner and to set up trusts and accounts that would secure the children's futures without granting uncontrolled access. I did these things with the deliberate temper of someone who had been burned by unexamined generosity. Rebuilding a home also involves reteaching patterns. I taught them, again as a teacher, that chores are part of belonging, that money has to be accounted for, that promises are a transaction of trust. I taught Chloe how to set a table properly, and Tyler how to change a tire with a practiced patience I remembered from summers working on my old station wagon. We planted a small herb garden where Frank's roses had been, and watching tender shoots push up from the soil felt like a small benediction. The civil and criminal cases ran along parallel tracks. In the criminal sphere, convictions led to orders of restitution. Marcus Webb worked with other victims to trace assets and file claims. The restitution process is never neat. It is messy and bureaucratic and slow. But there were recoveries, funds identified, claims made, and payments that eventually arrived. I used those funds to set up a trust for Tyler and Chloe, to repair the house where necessary, and to contribute to any other victims who had been identified in the investigations. I did not squander the money on displays. I used it for schooling, for a counselor who could help the children process a fractured childhood, and for a small nest of security that would let me sleep without recalculating budgets in the dead of night. People assume that when something like this resolves, you feel like you have won. I felt more complicated things. Vindication, yes, but also the weight of what was lost in the space where trust used to be.
I felt the small, soft grief for things that could not be restored by money or court orders. The time 17-year-old Tyler had spent worrying, or the early years of Chloe's innocence that had been arranged into a script by people who should have protected it. There were consequences for the adults beyond convictions. Some of them faced legal penalties, others social ones, and some remained outside the kind of public contraction that gives a court its small authority. What mattered to me was smaller, that my grandchildren could live with me and feel safe, that we could create routines, and that I had the legal ability to make decisions that would protect them. I also felt, with a certain clarity, the importance of boundaries. Saying "figure it out" that night was the beginning. Following through with evidence, with law, with work and testimony was the middle. The place where I slept better, after years of quiet worry, arrived only after slow and legal steps. People sometimes ask what justice tastes like. I do not taste triumphs. I taste a kind of balance. I taste recognition and the relief of paperwork that finally matches a lived reality. I taste the small goodness of a house that hums again, not because there is more money, but because there is less fear. Children are quieter in a house with secure routines. You hear them read with serious concentration. You hear the radio playing quietly while someone studies. You hear, in the evenings, the small communal noises of ordinary life. There were lessons, too, practical ones that would have saved me some naivete. I learned the hard way that generosity without boundaries can become a liability not just to you, but to the people you love. Saying yes repeatedly can teach people to expect yes forever. Saying no can feel brutal, an act of abandonment from the inside. But sometimes the kindest thing you can do is to define what you will and will not give. The hardest part is not the first no, it is the ongoing maintenance of that boundary. I also learned that dignity is not only something you preserve for yourself, it is something you model for your grandchildren. When they see me stand in a courtroom and speak plainly about what was done and what we must do to guard our lives, they learn that grown people sometimes make mistakes, but grown people can also make amends and set things right. That lesson matters more than money or titles. It matters because it teaches the next generation how to hold themselves. There were quieter consequences too. My sister and I mended some things. We did not mend everything. Some relationships were made frayed by the awkwardness of choices made under pressure. One of the stranger things about holding boundaries is how lonely they can feel when others do not understand them. I learned to be comfortable with being misunderstood by people I loved. That is a small education in humility.
In the months after the legal dust settled into files and transcripts, and the children's school lunches were routine, I found myself in the garden for long hours. Gardening is a task that requires both patience and trust. You plant seeds and trust time. You prune, you wait, and you learn that sudden, furious action rarely yields healthy growth. Watching Tyler and Chloe dash barefoot across the lawn, homework papers flopping from backpacks, I would sit at Frank's table and listen to the small clatter of ordinary life and take stock. Sometimes in the blue hour, when the sun leans low and the garden smells of cut grass and warm soil, Chloe will come and sit on my lap and whisper something innocent and precise. Maybe she'll say, "Grandma, I like your tea," and I will feel small and enormous at the same time. The word nobody, that night in the restaurant, now seems like a relic of a stage in the play we have left behind. It is a ghost that taught me a lesson I needed badly, that dignity can be taken by those who assume and reclaimed by those who refuse to yield. There is a caution embedded in all this. I do not tell people to follow my specific path as if it were a universal map. I do not recommend PIs and courtrooms as the only remedy for family betrayal. I only share what I did. My path included evidence, legal counsel, and testimony. It included the help of professionals and the kindness of neighbors. It required resources, financial, emotional, and legal, that not everyone will have. What I learned is less a prescription than a principle. Boundaries protect dignity, and dignity is worth protecting. Walking this line reconfigured my understanding of love. Love does not always mean saying yes. Sometimes it means saying no until safety can be built. Sometimes it means stepping into the uncomfortable role of being the adult who chooses to protect the children, even if that choice upsets others who are used to easier acquiescence. There is in that choice a kind of fierce compassion. As for the money that was recovered through restitution and claims, there was more than I expected, and we put it to practical uses. The trust we set up for Tyler and Chloe provides for school needs and counseling. We paid for a summer program Tyler had always wanted, for a piano that Chloe insisted would be for the house. We used some to help other victims identified in the investigation, because the harm was wider than our living room. The money did not erase what had been done, but it eased the pressure and allowed me to plan. Today, when I sit at the round table in the kitchen and watch them, it is hard not to feel gratitude laced with a certain guardedness. Tyler is studying a textbook, a pencil behind his ear. Chloe is teaching herself chords on the little keyboard we bought. The kettle hums. Outside, the roses I tend with my careful hands are in bud.
My neighbor Ruth drops by with a loaf of bread and a new kind of calm in her eyes. She admires, quietly, the way our house has refilled itself. People sometimes ask whether I regret the confrontation, the public exposure, the court dates. The answer is complex. I regret the need for it. No one should need to go to court to be treated respectfully by their family. But I do not regret the choice to stand up. There is a deep, quiet pride in having fought not for revenge, but for protection. Protection of myself and of the people who matter most. I also learned to forgive myself for being too trusting for too long. Trust is not weakness. It is a generous practice that sometimes needs recalibration. Saying, "figure it out," was not an act of cruelty. It was a boundary. Saying it was an act of love, for myself and ultimately for my grandchildren, who needed a home that was guided by someone who could hold them safely. If you are listening and you have been called names, if someone has ever made you feel small for the sake of their comfort, know this: dignity is not stolen if you reclaim it. The procedures are messy, the emotions raw, but there is a path to recovery and protection that does not require you to be anyone's second self. You can be the person you have always been. You can prune the garden and plant new seeds. The house is quieter now in the way of the comfortable. There are the expected disputes, homework arguments, the occasional slammed cupboard, but these are human noises, not those of people manipulating a life for gain. I have routines: morning tea, homework checks, a walk when I can, and sometimes at night, when the house breathes, and the old portrait of Frank looks down with that patient, amused expression he always wore, I think of that restaurant table and the small cruelty practice there. I think of how one tiny coached phrase, "You are nobody," bounced around a loud room and landed on my shoulders like an accusation. It did not stick. I swept it off with evidence, with calm, with law, and with the stubborn insistence of someone who refused invisibility. If there's a single piece of advice I would offer from all this, it is this: name what you are tolerating. If you cannot stop it alone, call for help. If your instincts tell you that patterns do not add up, gather facts. I say that not to give legal counsel. Each situation is different, but to offer the courage of a woman who learned to turn a private humiliation into a public reckoning that kept children safe. 2 years have unfolded since that navy dress night. The voices around our table are fuller. The laughter is less sharp and more whole. Chloe still speaks with a precision that delights me. Sometimes I tease her about it and she blushes as if embarrassed by her own crispness. Tyler is taller, less adolescent in posture, and has an awkward, earnest sense of responsibility that makes me proud. Tonight, as the sun drops, I will sit again at Frank's table. The children will be doing homework under the soft light of the lamp. I will sip tea and feel the heat at my fingers. I will think about the small, radical word I typed that night, "figure it out," and about the long road that followed.
I will remember the sting of being called nobody, and how small and childish that sounded compared to the lifetime of being seen for who I was. If my story has touched something in you, if you have ever been humiliated, used, or asked to make yourself small, I invite you to share in the comments. Where are you watching from? And what boundary are you holding or learning to hold? I do not have a universal remedy, but I know that telling the truth about what happened is the first kind of power. If you have a story, leave it below. If you value real-life stories that remind us how dignity and justice can intersect, please consider subscribing, so more people can hear how a quiet night and a single phrase can begin a long, slow repair. I am Margaret Sullivan. I once heard my granddaughter call me a nobody, and in a room full of people, the laughter landed like knives. I changed everything in one night, not because I wanted to punish, but because I chose to protect. The rest of it, court, custody, restitution, was the way we made that protection permanent. The garden still needs tending, and so do we. Boundaries are the small fences we build to let what matters grow.